There are probably hundreds of iconic weapons in video games, from Ezio's Hidden Blade, to Cloud's Buster Sword, to Kratos' Blades of Chaos. A good weapon can serve as not only a recognizable icon, but also a conduit with which to expand on the lore of the game universe. That's why I've decided to embark on a brand new journey for the channel and introduce a new series focusing on the lore of these weapons, which I'll call the lore of the Blades because, I don't know, that just sounds quispy. Of all the weapons of video gaming though, one stands out among them all as perhaps the most famous and iconic, and that would be the blue shell from Mario Kart. Just kidding, that might be the most infamous, but the most iconic would have to go to Link's Master Sword, also known as the Sword that Seals the Darkness, also known as the Blade of Evil's Bane, which is the blade we'll be focusing on in this video. And sure, everyone's probably heard of the Master Sword, but do you know the Master Sword? Whether you're a lore veteran of the franchise or a newcomer, I hope you'll enjoy this complete breakdown of the origins and lore surrounding every appearance of the Master Sword, which inevitably will delve into some theories to bridge the story gaps, so buckle up. Let's start though by talking briefly about the design of the blade itself, because I'm a nerd and I find this stuff interesting. The legendary Master Sword is typically depicted looking exactly the same in between titles, regardless of art style, except for randomly in the Wind Waker, where it features a different blade, color, pommel, crafter's mark, pretty much everything, but we'll get to that in a bit. While talking about the blade with my good buddy Ran over on Discord, we determined that the sword itself was designed to resemble most closely a bastard sword from real-life European history. And no, I'm not just trying to say a naughty word, that's what the sword is called. Bastard swords were very versatile and popular sword types used primarily by knights and soldiers in real-life history. Bastard swords sported very similar blades to the Master Sword that would taper to a point, but more primarily are also known and classified as hand-and-a-half swords, due to their handles being longer than a one-handed sword but shorter than a two-handed sword, such as a longsword, which led to their versatility in combat. As we can see, the Master Sword's handle is both long enough and short enough to be considered a hand-and-a-half handle, and Link is shown in the series using, sure enough, the sword both in one hand as well as two, depending on the situation. But enough about its design, let's talk about where it came from in the Zelda universe. One of the coolest things about the first game in the timeline, Skyward Sword, is the motion controls it introduced. Psych, it's actually the origin of the Master Sword that we were shown firsthand. Before the Master Sword was known as the Master Sword, it sported not only a completely different name, but a completely different design too. It was known as the Goddess Sword, which sported a much shorter blade and handle. But why and how did the Master Sword go through a growth spurt before becoming the blade that we know and love today, you might be asking? Well, in the beginning, the three golden goddesses that made the world itself left behind an all-powerful relic known as the Triforce, which is not problematic at all. But to protect said omnipotent Triforce, the goddesses created another goddess called Hylia and sent her to the land that would be known as Hyrule in order to protect the relic from the evil powers that be. In the first days, or at least the first days that we know of on the planet, the goddess Hylia used a sword that was appropriately named the Goddess Sword to fight against the demonic forces of demise in order to protect said prime energy. However, even though the goddess was eventually successful in sealing away the dreaded Demon King, she was both gravely injured from the battle and knew that the Demon King would one day break out. So, since she would not live long enough to meet demise upon his resurrection, she devised a plan. Well, two plans really, to ensure that someone else other than herself would take up the fight in the future. She then created a spirit known as Fi that would reside inside her very own goddess sword and act as a guide to its future wielder. Then placed the sword inside her monument and raised it up to the sky alongside Skyloft, where all of the other surviving early Hylians were placed. The other plan was that she also left her immortal form and became the reincarnating human known as Zelda, or perhaps Sonia, depending on when you believe these scenes take place. Anyway, sure enough, at some point in the future when Demise's power began to return, a young man known as Link was reached out to by the sword spirit Fi and led to the Goddess Sword, where he drew the blade and officially became the Zelda universe's first hero. The sword is unique in that it's capable of performing skyward strikes, which entail Link holding the blade, well, skyward, and imbuing it with divine power that can be struck directly at enemies or shot out from the blade as a beam of light. Something that we'll see the blade doing later on in the franchise. Along the journey, he meets the time-traveling Impa, who urges him to temper his blade with the three flames of the golden goddesses, after which the goddess sword transforms into its true form as the unawakened Master Sword. And after that, Link meets up with the reincarnation of the goddess Hylia known as Zelda, who reveals her true form as the reincarnated goddess Hylia, who blesses her old blade and causes it to become the true Master Sword, imbued fully with a power known as the Light Force. Now, what exactly the Light Force is a topic for another day, but for now, let's just assume that it's another force aside from the Triforce that is said to exist within all living beings. And there's also some reason to believe that it comes from the goddess Hylia herself, but that's just a theory. A Zelda theory. The true Master Sword unlocks its full potential at the end of the game though, where after defeating Demise in one-on-one combat, Link holds the blade skyward one last time as it seals away the Demon King, this time within the blade itself. Link then places the sword within a stone pedestal inside the sealed temple and leaves it there, and Fi declares that she will sleep inside the sword forever, which I personally believe is why the Master Sword is essentially alive and can apparently choose its hero. In reality, it's Fi inside the blade that waits for the return of her Link, her master, who reincarnates when the world needs a hero most. Now from this point through the remainder of the franchise, the Master Sword reappears here and there with mechanics or levels of power that differ from game to game, and oftentimes it appears to have been moved by an unknown individual. Or does it? For instance, the next game it pops up in on the timeline would be Ocarina of Time, where it's located in the Temple of Time and actually prevents Link from wielding it until he's of age, that being around 17 years old. Something that it apparently doesn't care about in the Wind Waker, Breath of the Wild, or pretty much all of the Fallen Timeline games. Hence the discrepancy. But as for the mystery of its Ocarina of Time location, the Hyrule Encyclopedia does state that the Sage of Light Rauru built the Temple of Time on the site of the old sealed temple from Skyward Sword, which of course would imply that nobody moved the sword in reality, a new temple was simply built around it. For all intents and purposes, once Link does use the blade as an adult, it seems to harness the same amount of divine power it had back in Skyward Sword. But curiously, it no longer possesses the ability to skyward strike or fire any beams of light out of its blade. When Link defeats Ganon at the end of his adult adventure, Ganondorf is not sealed within the blade this time, but rather a place called the Evil Realm, after which Link returns the Master Sword to its pedestal in the Child Timeline, where it rests until the next game it appears in that timeline, Twilight Princess. Now, once again, it appears to have been moved to a new Temple of Time that's located in the Lost Woods, known as the Sacred Grove in this game, but once again, there's a widely believed theory that states that this is actually the very same Temple of Time from Ocarina of Time due to several reasons. The overall generally similar layout, the presence of many Light Sage symbols, which is a connection to Rauru, the Light Sage, and the straight up, blatantly reused exact same Temple of Time theme from Ocarina. You might be wondering why then the Temple of Time is no longer located in Hyrule Castle Town like it was in Ocarina, but this theory implies that the Hyrule Castle Town from Ocarina is no longer there. What I mean by that is that it moved its location to where it is in Twilight Princess, which is why everything's laid out newly and looks generally pretty new, but that's besides the point. If this really is the same Temple of Time though, that means the Master Sword once again was not moved by anyone, which is fine by me of course. In this game, the Master Sword is so powerful that it will not abide any evil in its presence, and even immediately exorcises the dark power out of Link by simply being near him. As a reminder, the dark power that Zant placed within Link was given to him by Ganondorf, who received his power directly from the Triforce of Power, meaning that quite literally this proves to us that the Master Sword is proven to be more powerful than the power of the Triforce itself. The Master Sword is later used by Twilight Princess Link to open a stairway to the temple within the Temple of Time, and interestingly enough, cannot be seen in this pedestal when Link enters the Temple of Time's past version, which to me is possibly proof that the Master Sword only exists in one timeline at a time, which is going to come up again here in just a sec. After this, Link eventually travels via the reassembled Mirror of Twilight to the Realm of Twilight, and empowers the Master Sword with the light of the souls found there, which allows the blade to cut through the Twilight like butter and do much more damage when within the realm. Ultimately though, the blade is once again used to defeat the Demon King Ganondorf at the end of the game, halting the power of the Triforce again from saving Ganondorf's life, and therefore defeating the Lord of the Gerudo once and for all, in this timeline. In the credits, we can see that Link rests the blade back within its pedestal in the Temple of Time, and we have no further information on what happens with it after this point. Hopping over to the other timeline though, the adult timeline that Link was removed from at the end of Ocarina of Time, this is where things get a bit interesting, and I'll explain why after I recap the role of the Master Sword in its adult timeline appearance. In the Wind Waker, the Master Sword first appears down beneath the ocean, in the submerged, all but forgotten land of Hyrule. However, in this game, it's located not in the Temple of Time, but within Hyrule Castle itself, inside a secret chamber that can only really be described as a chamber of sages, if you will, complete with each awakened sage from Ocarina of Time's adult timeline represented on stained glass windows surrounding the blade's pedestal. In this game, the Blade of Evil's Bane alters time once again, but differently than it did in Ocarina of Time. In Wind Waker, it can freeze the minions of Ganon in stasis for as long as it rests in its pedestal. Once Link removes the sword, the minions reawaken and move once again and have to be cleared out by Link and his new trusty blade. However, when Link beelines immediately to Ganondorf and attempts to attack him using the, Blade of Evil's Bane, it is strangely unable to even scratch Ganondorf, who then gives us some interesting exposition about why. He claims that the Master Sword's power is gone, which he knew was going to happen since he killed the two new sages praying for its empowerment, the Sages of Earth and Wind. After this, Link sets out to find the new incarnations of the sages, Makar the Korok and Medli the Rito, and assists them both with entering their respective temples and officially awakening as the new sages, which successfully restores the blade to its shining, evil, pummeling glory. As a result, Link is able to use the Master Sword to dissolve the magical barrier encasing Ganon's tower down in Hyrule, once again heavily implying that the Master Sword does not give a shit about the Triforce of Power, which Ganondorf was using. Once at the top, the King of Red Lions wishes upon the Triforce before Ganondorf can get his hands on it right in front of him, which must have felt really amazing, wishing for the true flooding and destruction of Hyrule. And after an intense and beautifully dramatic final battle, Link drives the Master Sword into the forehead of Ganondorf, which transforms the Demon King into stone, also known as the new Master Sword pedestal. Following this, Hyrule is officially engulfed in water, and the Master Sword is left at the bottom of the ocean within the head of King Ganondorf. Now, like I said, there are a few discrepancies regarding the blade's appearance in Wind Waker that we have to talk about here. The first being its new location, implying someone had to move it. The second being its new power of holding evil in stasis in a 3D space / turning people into a very permanent version of stasis known as stone. And the third being the two brand new, never seen before or since sages necessary for empowering the Master Sword. There are two ways to explain this, the easy way and the bandit way. The easy way dictates that the Master Sword was moved by someone, possibly King Daphnis himself or perhaps a previous Zelda, and that the Master Sword always had the power of stasis, which we simply hadn't seen before or since, and that the Master Sword has always needed to be powered up, and these two new sages are simply the newest iterations of said power because Nintendo felt like it. The bandit way of explaining it, though, is that it's not actually the Master Sword. Well, not the original one, but rather a man-made one, which is why Ganondorf tells Link to go tell those fools who made the blade down below about its lack of power. Because remember, we know that the Master Sword apparently cannot be in multiple timelines at the same time, but if you'd like my complete thoughts on that though, please check out my full theory in the description after you're done here. Anyway, the Master Sword doesn't appear again in the adult timeline, leaving us with the Fallen timeline appearances to explain. Now, the Fallen timeline, as you know, is actually more of an alternate reality that occurs only if Link is defeated. So in this regard, the Master Sword does exist at the same time in this timeline, but this is simply because this is another reality. Capiche? Capiche. On that note though, the Master Sword's next appearance is within the Lost Woods on its pedestal, which quite frankly tracks, given that the Temple of Time was once located within the apparently nomadic magical Lost Woods, meaning nobody moved the blade yet again. Link is tasked with finding it in order to defeat the wizard Aghanim, also known as Ganondorf's alter ego, and he must first obtain the 3 pendants to remove it from its pedestal. In this game though, and really for every appearance in the Fallen timeline, the Master Sword has somehow obtained its ability to fire out beams of light at enemies when Link's at full health. Or maybe it always had the ability and the Links in Ocarina, Twilight, and Wind Waker just didn't know how to do it. Who knows? Link must also point it skyward in order to call down lightning and obtain the Ether Medallion, which sounds familiar, and it can also be forged into stronger versions of itself, ultimately taking on the form of the Golden Sword. Eventually, Link confronts and defeats the transformed Ganon within the Dark Realm with the Master Sword, and returns it to its pedestal within the Lost Woods at the end of the game. Its next appearance is in A Link Between Worlds, set in the exact same Hyrule as A Link to the Past, where Link can once again find it in the exact same pedestal, in the exact same place, using the exact same pendants. It can once again be forged into the exact same upgraded version, the Golden Sword, and can fire the same beams of light when Link is at full health. Interestingly though, an old man known as Gramps can actually wield the sword, which has led many to believe that Gramps is a previous Link, since after all, the Master Sword is choosy with who can wield it. Link uses the Master Sword to defeat Yuga, Ganon, and Hilda once again and returns it to its pedestal at the end of the game, in a very calming and poetic way. The legendary blade's next appearance is in the original Legend of Zelda, and I hear you already typing right now in the comments saying, "Wait, Bandit! That's actually the magic sword, not the Master Sword. This is what happens when all you do for research is read the wiki, you casual, unattractive theorist." And to that I say, ha! I might be unattractive, but what do you call this, huh? In the official Nintendo Player's Guide to A Link to the Past, which released with A Link to the Past, which was when the Master Sword was introduced to the world with its iconic design, Nintendo decided to beautifully illustrate the story of the first two Zelda games in this officially canon book. And wouldn't you know it, they chose to draw the aforementioned magic sword as the straight-up Master Sword, which can even fire beams of light at enemies when Link is at full health. So, take that, doubters. Anyway, the Master Sword is oddly in the possession of a seemingly random old man who's just kinda chilling in a graveyard. He will give Link the blade if Link has at least 12 hearts, and, well, that's really all there is to it. Link uses it to defeat Ganon, then goes on to use it solely in his next adventure known as Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. As far as who this old man was and just why he had the Master Sword, that is unfortunately 100% left up to speculation. And that wraps up the lore of the Master Sword on the canon timeline. Now, the blade does also appear in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which both take place in the future of an unspecified timeline. In those games, though, it appears to act almost completely differently. As for the first time in the series, it is shown to deteriorate with use and charge with lack of use, which might be due to the essence of demise within the blade, and could explain its power discrepancies across the series. It sleeps within a pedestal within the Lost Woods, which makes sense given the Ocarina Temple of Time connection, and was used by a hero who was possibly a Zonai that possibly looked like this 10,000 years before the events of the game in order to defeat the first recorded appearance of Calamity Ganon. Before the events of Breath of the Wild, it was drawn by Breath of the Wild Link at the age of around 12 or 13, when he found it himself within the Lost Woods, an event of which we know nothing about. He used the blade all throughout his knightly training and eventually used it in the climactic battle against Ganon's forces on the day of the Great Calamity, also known as Zelda's birthday. However, the blade appears very weary and straight up chipped and damaged, and Zelda herself carries it back to its pedestal for repair and, well, recharge for lack of a better word, while the mortally wounded Link is transported to the Shrine of Resurrection for, resurrection. Canonically, Link wakes up 100 years later after the Calamity and retrieves his old pal the Master Sword, then uses it to defeat Calamity Ganon once and for all. And a few years later in Tears of the Kingdom, completely shatters the blade upon attempting to fight against another Ganondorf who's been here chillin' underneath the castle since, the beginning of Hyrule, or so. Yeah, we're not going to go into explaining that one in this video though. One thing leads to another and Zelda ends up picking up a Zonai Secret Stone, falling backwards through time to the birth of Hyrule itself, and retrieving the Master Sword from Link in the future, which again is broken and withered and apparently can't recharge itself this time. Eventually, she decides that the only way to use both her Hylia power to restore the Master Sword to its former glory and also reach Link in the future/present time is to eat her Secret Stone and transform herself into an immortal dragon, fusing the Master Sword to her head and flying around the sky for countless ages, waiting for Link to come pluck it from her head, which he does indeed eventually do. He then uses the sword to destroy Ganondorf's Secret Stone, who at this point was also draconified. To be honest with you, the Master Sword is very different in the Wild Era games, which combined with their timeline placements, Zelda's different powers, a complete lack of the Triforce mentioned in those games at all, and the overlapping other Ganondorf does call their canonicity into a question, but I digress. Everything can be connected with the power of theories, of course, and with that, we have now explained every single appearance of the Master Sword, including the in-game lore behind it all. But if I missed anything, please let me know about it in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you'd be so kind, please consider leaving a like on the video as that helps so much more than you can imagine, and subscribe if you haven't already for much more gaming lore. You can always unsubscribe later if I lose my touch. Huge thanks as always to my Bandit crew who make my day every day, and that's all she wrote. Follow me on my socials, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Bandit, signing out. Peace!